They were the visionaries behind the camera, the men who could make or break a career with a single nod. In the golden age of British cinema and television, from the swinging 60s to the gritty 90s, the director's chair was often a throne of absolute power. But for many young actresses dreaming of stardom, the path to the big screen led through a locked office door. Tonight, we expose the industry titans who turned auditions into uncomfortable interrogations. Subscribe and comment. Is art ever an excuse for abuse? Michael Winner. For nearly half a century, Michael Winner was the caricature of the British film director. Loud, brash, and unapologetically abrasive. With his omnipresent cigar and his booming voice, he was a man who commanded attention, carving out a career that spanned the swinging 60s to the glossy 90s. He was the man behind the camera for gritty blockbusters like Death Wish, a filmmaker who knew exactly how to deliver violence and spectacle to the masses. In his later years, he reinvented himself as a restaurant critic, the charmingly rude man in the Sunday papers who would berate waiters for undercooked steak. However, behind the carefully cultivated image of the eccentric curmudgeon lay a reputation that was whispered about in every casting agency in London. For young actresses hoping for a break in the cutthroat world of cinema, an audition with Michael Winner was often a daunting and frequently humiliating ordeal. Winner was arguably the last of a dying breed of directors who operated the casting couch not as a secret shame, but as an open secret of his production process. He did not seemingly view women as artists to be nurtured, but as visual assets to be assessed, often with a cold and predatory detachment. Throughout the 1960s and 70s, stories circulated of his audition techniques, which frequently strayed far beyond the script. He was known for asking aspiring actresses to show him what they had, a request that had nothing to do with their acting ability and everything to do with their physical attributes. He would often demand that women remove their clothing in his private office, claiming that he needed to see how they moved or check for physical imperfections before he could cast them. The power dynamic in these encounters was terrifyingly absolute. On one side of the desk sat a powerful, wealthy man who could make a career with a single phone call. On the other, a young, often desperate woman trying to pay her rent. Winner exploited this imbalance with a staggering lack of empathy. He would reportedly tell actresses that if they were not willing to be free with their bodies, they were in the wrong business. He framed his demands as a test of their commitment to the art, a manipulative tactic designed to make them feel that refusing his requests was a sign of unprofessionalism. Those who walked out were often met with ridicule or the threat that they would be labeled difficult in an industry where reputation was everything. One of the most disturbing aspects of Winner's approach was his apparent lack of shame. In later interviews, he would often brush off accusations of misconduct with a wave of his hand, framing his behavior as simply the way things were done in the swinging 60s. He seemed to view the women he auditioned as commodities, interchangeable parts in his cinematic machine. He would recount stories of his conquests with a jovial arrogance, seemingly oblivious to the coercion involved. For him, the casting process was a game, and he held all the cards. He lived in a world where his behavior was enabled by a studio system that turned a blind eye to the personal conduct of its moneymakers, provided the films came in on time and under budget. By the time the industry began to change in the 1990s, Winner was seen by many as a dinosaur, a relic of a less enlightened age. Yet, the damage had been done. Dozens of women have since spoken about the creepy atmosphere of his auditions, describing feelings of powerlessness and degradation. Michael Winner died in 2013, celebrated by many as a colorful character of British life. However, for the actresses who faced his demands in that smoke-filled office, he is remembered not for his films, but for his abuse of power. His legacy is a stark reminder of a time when a director's artistic vision was often used as a flimsy excuse for personal gratification, leaving a trail of uncomfortable silences in his wake. Alfred Hitchcock. He was known to the world simply as the master of suspense, a cinematic genius whose silhouette was as famous as his films. Sir Alfred Hitchcock was the man who defined the thriller genre, terrifying audiences with masterpieces like Psycho and Vertigo. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, he was arguably the most famous director on the planet, a British export who had conquered Hollywood with his droll wit and his unparalleled eye for visual storytelling. However, behind the carefully curated image of the portly, deadpan gentleman lay a dark and possessive psychology that viewed his leading ladies not as collaborators, but as dolls to be dressed, directed, and controlled. His obsession with the cool blonde was legendary, but it was during the 1960s, with the arrival of an unknown model named Tippi Hedren, that this fixation spiraled into a campaign of terror that went far beyond the script. Hitchcock discovered Hedren in a television commercial and immediately saw her as a blank canvas upon which he could project his fantasies. He signed her to an exclusive 7-year contract, a common practice in the studio era, but one that Hitchcock wielded like a weapon. From the moment she stepped onto the set of The Birds in 1963, Hedren became the sole focus of his suffocating attention. He dictated every aspect of her life, from what she ate to who she associated with. He reportedly forbade the male cast and crew from speaking to her or socializing with her, isolating her completely so that he could be her only source of approval and companionship. He was a man who believed that his genius gave him the right to own his creation, and he expected a level of gratitude that crossed the boundaries of professional decency. The special gratitude Hitchcock demanded was not subtle. Hedren has since revealed that the director would often subject her to uncomfortable and unwanted advances, trapping her in corners or in the back of limousines, demanding that she be responsive to his affections. When she politely but firmly rejected him, maintaining her professionalism, the master turned into a monster. He began to use his power as a director to punish her for her refusal. The most infamous example of this retribution was the filming of the attic scene in The Birds. While the schedule called for mechanical birds, Hitchcock, in a fit of vindictive rage, secretly ordered the use of live ravens and seagulls. For 5 agonizing days, the birds were thrown at Hedren, pecking and scratching her until she collapsed from physical and emotional exhaustion. It was a torture session disguised as filmmaking, a punishment for a woman who dared to say no. The abuse continued into their next collaboration, Marnie, in 1964. Hitchcock's obsession deepened and his demands became more explicit. He installed a secret door connecting his office to her dressing room and reportedly had a life-sized mask of her face made for his own private use. The psychological pressure was immense. He told her in no uncertain terms that if she did not make herself available to him in the way he desired, he would ruin her. He viewed her rejection as a personal betrayal, a failure of the transaction he believed he had initiated. He gave her stardom, and in return, he expected total submission. When Hedren finally reached her breaking point and demanded to be released from her contract, Hitchcock delivered on his threat with a chilling calmness. He refused to release her. Instead, he kept her under contract for 2 years, paying her a weekly salary but refusing to let her work. He turned down offers from other major directors, effectively freezing her career at the very moment she was becoming a global star. He treated her like a piece of property that he would rather break than share. Tippi Hedren's career never fully recovered from the momentum she lost during those years of enforced silence. Hitchcock died a celebrated knight of the realm in 1980, his reputation as a genius intact. It is only in recent years that the voice of the woman he tried to silence has been fully heard, revealing that the true horror of his films was not the birds in the sky or the killer in the shower, but the man sitting in the director's chair, David Hamilton. In the 1970s and 80s, the aesthetic of soft focus photography was defined by one man, David Hamilton. Born in London, he became a global brand, a director and photographer whose hazy, sun-drenched images of young women graced the covers of magazines, posters, and films like Bilitis and Tendre Cousines. To the art world and the public, Hamilton was a visionary, a man who captured the fleeting, ethereal beauty of youth with a painterly eye that referenced the old masters. His films were celebrated as masterpieces of romantic innocence, filled with lace, wildflowers, and a dreamlike atmosphere that seduced audiences across Europe. He was a cultural icon, a British export who had conquered the continent, his work finding a home in the bedrooms of teenagers and the coffee tables of the elite, shielded from criticism by the unassailable label of high art. However, behind the Vaseline-smeared lens and the artistic pretensions lay a predator who used his camera as a passport to abuse. For decades, Hamilton operated with impunity, using his status as a renowned director to silence the parents and guardians of the very young girls he cast. He did not view these aspiring actresses and models as professionals with rights, but as objects to be collected for his own gratification. The casting process for his films and photo shoots was often a carefully laid trap. He would scout for girls on the beaches of the south of France or in the streets of European capitals, charming them and their families with promises of fame and immortality in his work. He presented himself as a gentle, eccentric artist, a persona that disarmed suspicion and allowed him access to his victims. The special gratitude Hamilton demanded was not a business transaction, it was a grooming process. He would isolate his subjects in his studios or on location, creating an environment where boundaries were blurred under the guise of artistic freedom. He convinced these young girls that their discomfort was a sign of immaturity, that true art required total surrender to the director's vision. He would often demand that they perform private auditions or pose in compromised situations that had nothing to do with the script and everything to do with his own desires. He was a master of manipulation, telling them that this was the price of becoming a muse, a necessary step to achieve the purity he sought to capture. He hid in plain sight, his crimes proudly displayed on gallery walls and cinema screens, protected by a culture that was terrified of being called prudish or Philistine for questioning the methods of a genius. The wall of silence finally crumbled in 2016 when the French television presenter Flavie Flament published a brave and harrowing memoir. She detailed the abuse she had suffered at Hamilton's hands as a teenager, describing a man who had stolen her childhood under the pretext of taking a photograph. Her revelation opened the floodgates, and soon, other women came forward with identical stories of a man who had used his power and his reputation to exploit their vulnerability. The master of soft focus was revealed to be a monster who had built his career on the suffering of the young. Faced with the prospect of a criminal investigation and the total destruction of his legacy, Hamilton took the coward's way out. He was found dead in his Paris apartment, having taken his own life, leaving his victims without the justice of a trial. His story is a chilling reminder of how the industry often allowed art to be used as a mask for the darkest of crimes. Gerald Thomas. To the British public, the Carry On films are a cherished national institution, a bawdy, seaside postcard world of harmless smut and slapstick comedy. For over 30 years, the franchise defined the humor of a nation, with its double entendre and its roster of beloved eccentrics like Sid James and Kenneth Williams. The man at the helm of this comedy juggernaut was Gerald Thomas, a director who, incredibly, helmed every single one of the 31 films in the series. He was known for his efficiency, his ability to shoot a movie in 6 weeks on a shoestring budget, and his loyalty to his rep company of actors. However, behind the laughter and the "ooh matron" catchphrases lay a casting culture that was deeply misogynistic and exploitative, a production line where young women were often treated with less respect than the props they stood next to. Thomas, along with the producer Peter Rogers, ran their operation at Pinewood Studios like a closed shop. The Carry On set was a notorious boys' club where the sexual innuendo of the scripts spilled over into real life. For aspiring actresses in the 1960s and 70s, a role in a Carry On film was a double-edged sword. It offered instant visibility, but it came with a heavy price. The audition process for the female roles, often referred to as glamour stooges, was reportedly a humiliating cattle market. Thomas was known to select women based almost entirely on their physical measurements. The ability to act was secondary to the ability to fill a bikini. Actresses were frequently asked to turn around, lift their skirts, or endure derogatory comments about their bodies, all under the guise of checking if they fit the costume. The power dynamic on the set was absolute. Thomas knew that for every actress who refused to play the game, there were 10 more waiting in the lobby who would. This allowed him to foster an environment where being a good sport was code for tolerating harassment. Women were expected to laugh off the wandering hands and the suggestive remarks from the cast and crew. If they complained, they were labeled difficult or frigid and simply not hired again. The pay was notoriously low, with even the biggest stars of the franchise receiving a pittance compared to the profits the films generated. For the young women in the supporting roles, The fee was negligible. The payment was the exposure, a currency that Thomas wielded with cynical precision. One of the most tragic figures associated with this era was Imogen Hassel, known by the tabloids as the Countess of Cleavage. She appeared in Carry On Loving and was a classic example of the type of actress Thomas sought: beautiful, willing, and ultimately disposable. She was typecast as the silent sex object, a role that she found increasingly suffocating. The industry, led by directors like Thomas, refused to see her as anything more than a body. The constant pressure to maintain a perfect image and the hollowness of the roles she was offered contributed to a deep depression. She took her own life at the age of 38, a victim of an industry that chewed up young women and spat them out when they were no longer fresh. Gerald Thomas died in 1993, leaving behind a legacy that is complicated. On one hand, he brought joy to millions. On the other, he presided over a regime that institutionalized the objectification of women. The Carry On films are now viewed by many as a time capsule of a less enlightened age, but for the actresses who walked onto those freezing sets in nothing but flimsy lingerie, the experience was far from a comedy. Thomas was the ringmaster of a circus where the laughter was often at the expense of the women he claimed to adore, proving that in the world of British comedy, the joke was often a mask for a much darker reality. Stanley Long. In the 1970s, while the British film industry was collapsing under the weight of strikes and a lack of funding, one sector was booming: the sex comedy. At the forefront of this dubious renaissance was Stanley Long, a man dubbed the King of Sexploitation. He was the producer and director behind the Adventures series, Adventures of a Taxi Driver, Adventures of a Plumber's Mate, films that were made for pennies and grossed millions. To the public, these movies were harmless, cheeky fun, a continuation of the seaside postcard humor that the British loved. They were filled with slapstick, double entendres, and an endless parade of young women in varying states of undress. Long presented himself as a savvy businessman, a man giving the public what they wanted in a grey and depressing decade. However, the reality of Long's factory line production method was a grim reflection of the industry's attitude towards women. For aspiring actresses in the 70s, the casting couch was not a myth. It was a business model, and Long's office was its headquarters. The audition process for his films was notoriously degrading. Women were not asked to read lines, they were asked to disrobe. Long viewed actresses as interchangeable commodities, livestock to be assessed for their physical assets, and nothing more. The scripts were often written after the casting, tailored to showcase the specific attributes of the women he had selected. He operated in a world where a woman's value was directly tied to her willingness to be liberated on camera. The power dynamic was stark. Long was the gatekeeper to the only steady work available in the British film industry at the time. Serious drama had dried up. If a young actress wanted to work, she often had to go through the world of soft porn. Long knew this and exploited it with a cool, detached efficiency. He would often persuade hesitant actresses that nudity was artistic or essential to the plot, a laughable claim given the quality of the films. He created an environment where the boundaries of professionalism were non-existent. There were no intimacy coordinators, no safeguards, just a director with a camera and a young woman who had been told that this was her only shot at stardom. One of the most insidious aspects of Long's legacy was the bait and switch. Actresses would often sign contracts for what they believed were glamour roles, only to find on the day of shooting that the demands had changed. They were pressured into performing scenes that were far more explicit than agreed, with the threat that they would be replaced and blacklisted if they refused. It was coercion disguised as contract law. Long thrived on the desperation of the era, building a fortune on the exploitation of women who had no voice and no recourse. By the time the genre died out in the 80s, replaced by home video and changing tastes, Stanley Long had made his millions and moved on. He remained unrepentant to the end, viewing himself as a provider of entertainment rather than an exploiter of women. However, for the hundreds of actresses who passed through his casting sessions, the memory is not one of cheeky fun, but of a cold, transactional meat market where their dignity was the price of admission. His films remain a testament to a decade where the British film industry survived by selling the bodies of its actresses, with Stanley Long as the man counting the cash at the door. Harrison Marks. In the neon-lit, rain-slicked streets of Soho during the 1960s, Harrison Marks was the undisputed king of a shadowy empire. He was not a director who courted the critics of the grand film festivals. Rather, he was the king of glamour, a photographer turned filmmaker who defined the aesthetic of the British top-shelf industry. To the public, he was a cheeky, lovable rogue, a man with an eye for beauty who had discovered some of the most famous models of the decade, including his longtime muse, Pamela Green. He directed films like The 9 Ages of Nakedness and Come Play With Me, the latter of which ran for an astonishing 4 years at a cinema in London, becoming a cultural phenomenon of the era. He presented himself as an artist of the human form, a man liberating the British public from their Victorian prudery with a camera and a smile. However, behind the lens of his Hasselblad and the clapperboard of his film sets, Marx operated a regime that was built entirely on the exploitation of naive ambition. He was the gatekeeper to a world that thousands of young women were desperate to enter, the world of fame. In the 1960s, the glamour model was a new kind of celebrity, and Marx was the man who could make it happen. Young girls, often runaways or dreamers from the provinces, would arrive at his studio in Gerrard Street believing they were auditioning for a legitimate acting career or a high-fashion shoot. Instead, they walked into a carefully constructed trap where the boundaries of professionalism were non-existent. The audition process for a Harrison Marx production was a masterclass in manipulation. He would often begin by charming the aspiring actresses, telling them they had the look of a star, comparing them to the icons of the day like Brigitte Bardot. Once the flattery had taken hold, the demands would begin. He would explain that to be a star in his films, they had to be comfortable with their bodies. The request to remove clothing was not presented as a choice, but as a prerequisite for the job. He created an environment where refusal was framed as a lack of ambition. If you want to be an actress, he would imply, you have to leave your inhibitions at the door. For a 19-year-old girl with no agent and no money, the pressure to comply was overwhelming. Marx thrived on the power imbalance. He knew that for every girl who walked out in tears, there was another waiting in the reception area who was desperate enough to stay. He treated women as interchangeable components in his glamour factory. The films he directed were often little more than excuses to display nudity, with scripts that were thin veils for voyeurism. The actresses were paid a pittance for their work, often signing away their rights for a flat fee of a few pounds, while Marx made a fortune from the distribution rights. He was a man who monetized the vulnerability of women, selling their images to a hungry public while they received nothing but a fleeting moment of exposure that often haunted them for the rest of their lives. The tragedy of the Harrison Marx era was the disposability of the talent. Once a girl had been featured in his magazines and films, she was often discarded for the next fresh face. Many of these women found that their association with Marx made it impossible to get serious acting work later on. They had been branded by the industry, typed as glamour girls, who were not to be taken seriously by mainstream casting directors. Marx, meanwhile, continued to build his myth, seemingly oblivious to the human cost of his empire. He died in 1997, remembered by some as a pioneer of the permissive society, but by many of his former stars as a man who promised them the world and gave them nothing but shame. His legacy is a stark reminder of the dark underbelly of the swinging 60s, where the liberation of the era often meant the freedom for men to take what they wanted, while women paid the price. Ken Russell. In the flamboyant and excessive world of 1970s British cinema, Ken Russell was the undisputed enfant terrible. He was a director who did not just push boundaries, he obliterated them with a sledgehammer. His films, such as Women in Love and the controversial masterpiece The Devils, were operatic explosions of sexuality, violence, and religious imagery that shocked the establishment and thrilled the critics. To the public, Russell was a genius, a visionary artist who was dragging the polite British film industry into the modern age with his raw, visceral storytelling. He was the man who made Glenda Jackson an Oscar winner and Oliver Reed a legend. However, behind the acclaim and the artistic pretensions lay a casting process that was often deeply disturbing, a psychological gauntlet that many actresses found to be intrusive, voyeuristic, and ultimately degrading. Russell's method was built on the idea of breaking down his actors to find their truth, but for the young women who auditioned for him, this often meant a complete surrender of their bodily autonomy. He was notorious for his private auditions, which were frequently held not in a studio office with a casting director present, but in his own home, in a living room filled with religious icons and loud classical music. The atmosphere was designed to be disorienting, a test of the actress's ability to submit to his overwhelming personality. He would often demand that women perform improvisations that had little to do with the script, but required them to strip naked and dance or scream while he watched, assessing their inhibitions. The power dynamic in these sessions was absolute. Russell was the gatekeeper to the most exciting roles in British cinema, and he made it clear that only those willing to bear everything, physically and emotionally, would be welcomed into his inner circle. He framed his demands as artistic necessity, a way of weeding out the frigid or the uncommitted. He would tell aspiring actresses that if they were uncomfortable with nudity in his living room, they would never survive on his set. This manipulation forced many women into a corner, refuse and be labeled a prude who didn't understand art, or comply and endure a humiliating performance for an audience of one. The special gratitude Russell demanded was not always explicitly sexual in the traditional sense, but it was a demand for total ownership of the actress's body and image. He treated his leading ladies as clay to be molded, often pushing them into situations on set that bordered on abuse. During the filming of The Devils, the extras and actors were subjected to scenes of hysteria and degradation that were so intense many were left traumatized. Russell thrived on the chaos, feeding off the vulnerability of the women he directed. He believed that his genius gave him the right to demand anything, no matter how intrusive, in the pursuit of his vision. One of the most telling aspects of Russell's reputation was the silence that surrounded his methods for so long. Because his films were critically acclaimed, his behavior was indulged as the eccentricity of a great artist. The industry turned a blind eye to the fact that his tests were often little more than power plays designed to assert dominance before a contract was even signed. Ken Russell died in 2011, leaving behind a complex legacy. He created some of the most memorable images in cinema history, but for the actresses who had to endure his auditions to get there, the memory is often one of discomfort and a feeling that their dignity was the price of admission to his twisted world. He was a man who believed that art justified everything, even the exploitation of the very muses he claimed to adore. Donald Cammell. In the lexicon of British cinema, Donald Cammell is often remembered as the dark prince of the swinging 60s, a man whose artistic vision was as dangerous as it was revolutionary. He was a painter, a socialite, and a director who moved in the inner circles of the Rolling Stones, inhabiting a world of rock and roll decadence that most people only read about in the tabloids. His directorial debut, Performance, co-directed with Nicholas Roeg in 1970, is widely considered one of the greatest British films of all time. It was a psychedelic, mind-bending exploration of identity and violence that starred Mick Jagger and James Fox. To the critics, Cammell was a genius who pushed the boundaries of the medium, a man who sought to capture the truth of human experience, no matter how ugly or chaotic. However, behind the bohemian glamour and the artistic pretensions lay a manipulative and often cruel personality who viewed his actors not as colleagues, but as subjects in a psychological experiment. Cammell's approach to filmmaking was heavily influenced by the idea of breaking down the performer to reach a state of raw vulnerability. While this sounds like a legitimate artistic technique, in practice, it often devolved into a form of psychological torture, particularly for the women he cast. The set of Performance was not a professional workplace. It was a sealed environment where the lines between reality and fiction were deliberately blurred. Cammell created a method atmosphere that was fueled by illicit substances and sexual tension. He did not just direct scenes, he orchestrated real-life dramas, manipulating the relationships between his cast members to extract the reactions he wanted on camera. The primary victim of Cammell's method was the actress Anita Pallenberg. At the time, she was in a relationship with Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, but Cammell, obsessed with capturing authentic intimacy, actively encouraged and manipulated a real-life tryst between Pallenberg and her co-star Mick Jagger during the filming. He viewed Pallenberg not as an actress to be protected, but as a catalyst for the male egos on set. He exploited her vulnerability and her personal life, using her betrayal of Richards as a tool to create tension in the film. The scenes of intimacy were not simulated in the traditional sense. Campbell demanded a level of realism that crossed the boundaries of professional acting, effectively turning the set into a voyeuristic arena for his own fascination with decadence. Campbell's behavior was not limited to a single film. Throughout his career, which was sporadic and plagued by his own demons, he maintained a reputation for being obsessively controlling and emotionally intrusive. He would often demand that actresses perform in a state of undress or emotional distress, claiming that he needed to see their soul. He was a director who thrived on the discomfort of others, believing that art required sacrifice, though it was usually the women in his films who did the sacrificing. He operated in the shadows of the industry, a cult figure whose genius was often used to excuse behavior that would have been unacceptable in any other profession. The tragedy of Donald Cammell was that his immense talent was inextricably linked to his destructive personality. He was a man who lived on the edge, and he expected everyone around him to jump off the cliff with him. His later career in Hollywood was marked by conflicts with studios and a deepening isolation. He died by suicide in 1996, a final, violent act that mirrored the intensity of his work. For the women who worked with him, particularly Pallenberg, the experience was often described as a journey into madness, a time when they were used as pawns in a director's twisted game of chess. Cammell remains a celebrated figure in film history, but his legacy is stained by the knowledge that his masterpieces were built on the manipulation and exploitation of the people he was supposed to guide. Roy Bolting. In the pantheon of British cinema, the Bolting brothers, Roy and John, were practically royalty. For decades, they were the twin pillars of the industry, producing and directing satirical masterpieces like I'm All Right, Jack and Brighton Rock. They were the establishment, men of immense power and influence who could greenlight a picture with a single phone call. Roy Bolting, in particular, was the intellectual heavyweight, a man known for his sharp wit and his cynical view of British institutions. However, in the mid-1960s, his reputation took a turn that shocked the nation and exposed the disturbing power dynamics that often lurked behind the mentorship of young stars. The story of Roy Bolting is not one of a casting couch in the traditional sense, but of a Svengali complex where the lines between professional direction and personal possession were completely erased. The target of his attention was arguably the most famous young woman in the world at the time, Hayley Mills. She was the golden girl of Disney, the star of Pollyanna and The Parent Trap, a teenager whose face was on lunchboxes and magazine covers across the globe. She represented absolute innocence, the nation's sweetheart who was safe, wholesome, and untouchable. In 1966, at the age of 20, she was cast in The Family Way, a gritty northern drama directed by Roy Bolting. At 53, Bolting was 33 years her senior, a man old enough to be her grandfather. Yet, from the moment production began, he initiated a pursuit of the young actress that would dismantle her carefully curated image and alienate her from her own family. Bolting did not just direct Mills, he groomed her for a new reality. He convinced her that to be a serious actress, she needed to shed the Disney image that had made her a star. Under his direction, she filmed a scene that required her to appear nude from the waist up, a moment that caused a seismic scandal in the British press. To the public, it felt as though their child star had been corrupted, and the man behind the camera was the architect of this loss of innocence. Bolting used his position of authority, his intellect, and his status as a legendary director to isolate Mills from her protective father, the actor John Mills, and draw her into his world. He presented himself as the only man who understood her artistic potential, the key to unlocking her womanhood. The relationship that followed was a classic example of the director and the muse, but with a toxic undercurrent of control. Bolting left his wife to be with Mills, and the two became the most talked about couple in Britain. He took total control of her career, steering her away from the family-friendly roles that had made her wealthy and pushing her into adult psychodramas like Twisted Nerve. He seemed determined to remold her in his own image, to prove that he could take the Disney doll and turn her into a complex, sexualized woman. However, the public rejected this transformation. They did not want to see Hayley Mills playing a victim or a femme fatale. They wanted the girl they loved. Boulting's insistence on casting her in these roles effectively torpedoed her film career in the late 60s. The special gratitude Boulting extracted from Mills was the consumption of her youth. For over a decade, she remained in his orbit, marrying him in 1971 and having a son, Crispian. But the power dynamic never shifted. He was the master and she was the creation. As his own career began to fade in the 1970s, he clung to her fame, using her name to secure funding for projects that were often beneath her talents. When the marriage finally collapsed in 1977, Mills was left to rebuild her life and her career from the wreckage. She later spoke of the relationship with a mixture of love and regret, acknowledging that she had been swept away by a man who held all the cards. Roy Boulting died in 2001, remembered as a giant of cinema, but his legacy is forever complicated by the fact that he used his director's chair to claim the one prize that should have been off limits, the innocence of the nation's daughter. Roman Polanski. Although he was born in Paris and is often associated with Hollywood or European cinema, Roman Polanski was the undisputed king of swinging London in the 1960s. He arrived in Britain as a young prodigy from Poland and immediately established himself as the darling of the British film industry. With masterpieces like Repulsion, filmed in Kensington, and Cul-de-sac, shot on Holy Island, he defined the dark, psychological underbelly of the decade. To the critics and the public, he was a genius, a man who could coax performances of terrifying intensity from his actors. He moved in the highest circles of London society, partying with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, a charismatic figure who seemed to embody the artistic liberation of the era. However, behind the acclaim and the cool persona lay a disturbing pattern of behavior that would eventually force him to flee the English-speaking world forever. Polanski's approach to casting and directing was often described as obsessive and deeply manipulative. In 1971, he returned to Britain to film a gritty, violent adaptation of Macbeth, financed by Hugh Hefner's Playboy Productions. The production was notorious for its dark atmosphere. Polanski, still grieving the tragic death of his wife Sharon Tate, channeled his trauma into the film, but he also reportedly created an environment of intense pressure for his young cast. He was known for his preference for very young women, a predilection that was an open secret in the London club scene. He did not view youth as a boundary to be respected, but as a quality to be captured and consumed. The casting for his films and his personal life often blurred into one, with the director using his immense status to attract young girls who were dazzled by his fame and his tragic backstory. The special gratitude Polanski expected was part of a lifestyle that rejected all traditional moral codes. He operated in a world where free love was often used as a cover for the exploitation of the naive. While his most famous crime, the statutory rape of a 13-year-old girl, occurred in the United States in 1977, the seeds of that behavior were sown during his years in London and Europe. He was a man who believed that his artistic genius placed him above the law, a view that was unfortunately shared by many in the industry who continued to celebrate him even after his conviction. He treated the women in his life, and often in his films, as vessels for his own anxieties and desires, pushing them to emotional extremes to get the perfect shot. The filming of Macbeth in North Wales and Shepperton Studios is often cited as a prime example of his controlling method. He demanded humiliating levels of nudity and violence from his actors, justifying it as historical accuracy. The actress Francesca Annis, who played Lady Macbeth, was subjected to a sleepwalking scene that required full nudity, a decision that was controversial even in the permissive 70s. Polanski's direction was forensic and unyielding. He treated his actors like props to be moved and exposed at his will. He was a director who thrived on the discomfort of others, believing that true art could only be created through suffering, usually the suffering of the women on screen. Roman Polanski remains a fugitive from American justice to this day, living in Europe and continuing to make films. His legacy in Britain is a complicated one. He gave the country some of its greatest cinematic works, but he also left behind a stain on the industry. He was the ultimate example of the auteur who was allowed to do whatever he wanted because he delivered brilliance on screen. For the young women who crossed his path in the clubs of Chelsea or the studios of Shepperton, the memory of the genius is likely far darker than the critics would care to admit. His story is the final, damning chapter of an era where talent was the ultimate alibi for abuse.